How did we get here? This is a question that I think a lot of us are asking right now, and given the recent events of the last few weeks and the last few months that are just starting to come to light. A lot of us who haven't thought about American history for a while are kind of confused about how we got to this point. And sometimes we can think back to just some recent events and look at some immediate actions of police brutality against African Americans and think this is where the story started. But there's a much longer history to how we got here. And that's what these videos are about, is trying to give context and trying to help understand how we got here. Because one path towards undoing the place we are today and or undoing some of the structures of racism, both in our society and in ourselves, is to learning about how we got here. How did the concept of race and the racial categories that we have today get developed by societies and cultures and bring us to the place that we are today? And that's really what we want to get into here today. Because ultimately, race is a social construct. You've probably heard that phrase before. Race is a social construct. Sometimes we can take that phrase and think that it means that race is just fake. I don't need to pay attention to it because it's something that's made up. It's not real. So I don't have to pay that much attention to it. That's not what it means at all. What it really means is that race is not biological. It's a category that was invented by society, invented by groups of people as a way to organize groups and as a way to consolidate power and control. It's a social construct. It's something that our societies have developed over time in order to consolidate power and control. And even if we didn't create it as white people here today, we have inherited it. It's the way our society is organized and the thing that we inherited just by growing up in the society we're in. And once we recognize it, we can also begin to challenge it. This is what I believe Romans 12:2 is all about. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. As we begin to learn new things, our minds can be transformed and we can challenge the patterns of this world. So where do we start? Well, a lot of different folks will start in different places as they begin to tell this story. I like to start this story in Africa, as white Europeans, and particularly as white Englishmen, begin traveling into Africa and encountering Africans, many of them for the first time. These encounters are particularly telling. Now, the Spanish and the Italians had actually had quite a bit of interaction with people from Africa, particularly the Moors, a group from North Africa who had come into Spain in the Middle Ages and been there up until around the 1600s. And so dark-skinned people were not necessarily new to Spanish and Italian and other travelers as they came into Africa. But for the English, it was a little bit different. They're much further removed, if you think about the map of Europe. And as they enter into Africa, they are very surprised and very confused by dark-skinned people groups that they encounter. It's also the reality that they enter into Africa through West Africa, and particularly the Congo, and the people in those places were even darker skinned than Northern African people. So the shock was even more for them, and they began to try to understand and label and categorize these groups. And much of the English travelers began referring to these people as black. They began referring to them as black people, as people with black skin, and this became a common vernacular in their language as they explained these new people groups. Now, we know if you've seen the movie Malcolm X or read the autobiography of Malcolm X, as he reads through the dictionary the words white and the words black, black is not just a descriptor. It's not a neutral term. It's a signifier of more things. And the word black signifies dirty, dark, deadly, foul, and wicked. So by naming and calling these people black, they were not being neutral. They were not just being descriptors of these folks. They are starting to categorize them by the very character of the names and words that they use. This doesn't mean that the word black today always has negative connotations. Many of us get caught up in whether we say African American or black. Trust your brothers and sisters of color to lead you in this and let them guide you on how they prefer to be called and referred to. But black is not a dirty word for them. But in the origins of it had its roots there in those places and in those things. The English were also very fascinated by the society and the culture of these African peoples that they encountered, and particularly the sexuality of those cultures. And we're going to see that again in just a minute. It was part of the wider Enlightenment Project to go around the world and categorize everything, to put it into categories, right? In the same way that we're categorizing all kinds of plants and animals and all kinds of these things, we're categorizing people groups. But again, these categories are not neutral. Europeans have already decided they are at the top of the ladder of civilization, and the groups that they begin to encounter, they are putting them in rungs below themselves. And so this is not a neutral project. This is a project to categorize where these people fit. But they are obviously not above us. They're definitely going to be below us somewhere. And so they become fascinated with these groups. In particular, religion became a way for them to understand this new group that they encountered. Many European travelers would hearken to the story of Genesis 9, the story of Noah, Ham, and Ham's son Canaan. In the story, Canaan stumbles upon Noah naked in his cave, and he goes and tells his brothers about it. The brothers go and back into the cave and lay a blanket over Noah and his nakedness. Noah, by the way, was drunk in this story, so he's not totally without merit here. But they go and they lay a blanket over him. When Noah wakes up, he's so mad at Ham for what he's done that he says this in Genesis 9:25. Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. Now, why Canaan gets charged here and not Ham, I'm not really sure. But for the Europeans, as they encountered these new people who they considered to be humans, to be part of the human race, but they had to figure out who they were, how they were connected back into this Adam and Eve story and this story of Noah's many sons, they connected them to Canaan. And in particular, in 1623, Richard Jobson writes a book called The Golden Trade. And he makes this direct connection. So many people throughout England would have read this book, this account of this Englishman traveling into Africa. And he makes a direct connection between the story in Genesis 9 and particularly the sexuality of African men. And I'm going to leave it there for that. But this connection is made between these folks. And so we can see already that the view of blackness is getting hardened already in just a century or so. That blackness means wicked, evil, disorganized, hypersexual, cursed by God, and they're human, but they are certainly not equal to whites. And as we're going to see from the story of Canaan, they are going to be subject to slavery as well. Now, this isn't just a story about the English, and it isn't just a blame it on the English for creating this whole thing. The Spanish and the Portuguese were also in this project. We all know the story. 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue and discovers a new world. There were already people there, so you can't really discover that. Columbus has his own history of pillaging the islands and places that he's encountered. But as he returns back to Europe, what happens is that the Spanish and the Portuguese have a fight over who these new lands belong to. And it's Alexander VI, the Pope, who actually intervenes. He issues a papal bull called Inter Cetera and grants different pieces of the New World, the Americas, to the Spanish and the Portuguese monarchs. He's trying to gain favor with them and consolidate his power as Pope. As a part of the Inter Cetera, the conquistadors, the European travelers who would go and conquer these new lands, were required to read a work called the Requiremento. This is just a little bit of what it said. Therefore, I beg and require of you, as best as I can, that you recognize the Church as Lord and Superior of the universal world and the Pope, and that you, these native peoples they've encountered, that you consent to what the religious fathers declare and preach, And his majesty and I, in his name, will receive you and will leave your women and children free, without servitude, so that with them and with yourselves you can freely do what you wish, and we will not compel you to turn to Christians. But if you do not do it, with the help of God, I will enter forcefully against you, and I will make war everywhere and however I can. This is their evangelism strategy, to go to these new native peoples and threaten them with slavery and war if they don't pledge loyalty to the king that they represent. They're not going to force them to be Christians, but they're certainly going to get their loyalty out of it. As the Spanish and the Portuguese begin conquering these lands, what they do is they grant large areas of land to the European settlers. And they tell those settlers to collect all the gold and precious metals in those places from the native peoples that reside in those lands. They can keep some and send the rest back to the crown that they came from. But when the gold starts to run out, the European settlers begin to turn to creating plantations and enslaving the native peoples there in the Americas. Now, not everybody was on board with this project, and some of them recognized the problem and the issues that were happening. Bartolomeo de las Casas was actually a Spanish priest who was living in the Americas at the time. In 1511, he actually freed his own slaves and began petitioning the king for the plight of native peoples in his country and in those places. The king did listen. He didn't lift all the bans, and certainly native peoples were still persecuted, but he did listen to Las Casas. This is a little bit what Las Casas wrote in a short account of the destruction of the Indies. He wrote, "Two principal and general customs have been employed by those calling themselves Christians. The first being unjust, cruel, bloody, and tyrannical warfare. The other, after having slain all those who might yearn toward or surprise after or think of freedom or consider escaping from the torments they are made to suffer, that they would oppress them with the hardest, harshest, and most heinous bondage to which men or beast might ever be bound into." And so Las Casas questioned these things. He was eventually named protector of the Indians and improved the situation for some of the natives in the Americas. Certainly not all of them, but he was able to do something. The problem, though, was that all these Europeans had these large swaths of land that they were needing to farm to get these crops and sell them back to European markets. So they still needed cheap labor. And initially, Las Casas actually endorses the use of the importation of African slaves into the Americas to begin to work on these large plantations to grow sugar and other products and send them back to Europe. Now, Las Casas would later recant this, and he would later reject this importation of African slavery, but the pattern was set. And a century or so later, as Englishmen begin arriving in the Americas, they follow this pattern that they've seen from the Spanish and the Portuguese. They go into these new places and they look for deposits of gold and precious metals. Unfortunately, in North America, they don't find them. So they begin looking for large groups of native peoples that they can begin to work on plantations. Same problem, not as much large concentrated groups of native peoples in the North American context. So they skip ahead to the solution that the Spanish had already figured out and the Portuguese had figured out and begin importing Africans into the Americas to work as slaves on these large plantations. Albert Roboteau, in his famous book Canaan Land, describes it this way. He says, "In the Mediterranean world, Africans had been one among many peoples trapped in slavery. But slavery in the Atlantic world took on a racial definition that identified slave status with Africans and the black color of their skin." This is the story we found so far. How did we get here? Well, the beginning of this story is that European exploration was not neutral. They're categorizing these groups, and it's done by valuing some groups over others. And religion becomes an excuse to disguise greed and disguise hatred. The economic drive for gold and new markets and cheap labor leads to the use of slavery over entire people groups just because of the color of their skin. And all of this is done largely with the support of individual Christians as well as the institutional church. Now, it's easy to listen to this story and say, this isn't me. I'm not responsible for this. I didn't do it. What do you want me to do here? But this story really isn't about guilt or responsibility for us as white people today. It's about advocacy and it's about awareness, because these biases still exist. When you watch a media story about a person that was killed by police and they begin to show you mugshots and tell you about arrest records, and they immediately move to that impulse is the same thing we're seeing here centuries ago. That idea, that concept that people are inherently wicked, evil in these places, that they're inherently criminal, that impulse is rooted here in the 1400s, 1500s, and 1600s. There's a long history of it. And so if we know that these impulses are wrong, if we know that these impulses are sinful, we must begin to use our voices to critique them. Because this is how we got here. But the real question is, where are we going next? I hope you enjoyed this. We'll be back next week with another video continuing the story, moving forward into particularly the context of the early United States and the experience of slavery there. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I would encourage you to check out the links below with some other resources. Go and read some of these primary sources and some of the books that are suggested here. Particularly a great book by Winthrop Jordan called White Over Black that really explains a lot of the context of what I've talked about here today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let us know if you have any questions. We'd love to hear from you.